Alright everyone, this is Staff Sergeant Bryant with the CKC. I wanted to say welcome to another one of our speaker series. Today our guest is Margaret Myers. She's going to be speaking Chinese engagements with Latin America. I just have a couple admin things to go over real quick. This presentation is going to be about 30-45 minutes long. We ask that you save your questions at the end. They can be submitted through the chat pod. And just a reminder too that this is being recorded and it is an unclassified speaker, so please keep it that way. And I will go ahead and let Margaret take over now and enjoy.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'll just wait for my slides to pop up here. Thank you, Sergeant Bryant, and thank you to the Cultural Knowledge Consortium for the opportunity to participate in this event today. So my plan today is to talk very briefly about Sino-Latin American relations, looking specifically at China's plans for economic and social development over the next few years, and what they will mean for future relations with Latin America and other regions. I'll begin with a summary of the ways in which China is currently engaging Latin America, and then offer some thoughts on China's perceived strategy in the region. And I'll finally conclude with a brief summary of political, social, and economic factors in China that could affect relations with Latin America in coming years. So first of all, how does China prefer to engage Latin America? The China-Latin America relationship is fundamentally an economic one. For about a decade, basically since China entered the World Trade Organization in 2001, China-Latin America relations have been based on trade and have been dominated by 5 countries and 8 economic sectors. Here you'll see that commodities like copper, iron ore, soy, petroleum, and pulp even make up the vast majority of Latin American exports to China, or 81% in 2009. And only really 5 countries, Chile, Brazil, Argentina, Colombia, and Peru, tend to dominate commodities trade with China. So it's important to understand, therefore, that the China boom in Latin America, as it's often called, isn't always evident throughout the entire region. Some countries have benefited significantly more from growing relations with China than others. Here are the major exports from Latin America and principal exporting countries in 2008. Soybeans, as you'll see in the blue section there, primarily from Brazil and Argentina, represented 22% of exports to China in 2008. So again, trade is dominated by specific countries and specific sectors. Among Latin American countries, Mexico also has been a principal exporter to China, although the economic relationship between China and Mexico, as with Central America and China, has been one of competition and not of trade complementarity necessarily. When looking at the China-Latin America economic engagement from a comparative perspective, it's also important to understand that Latin American trade has grown not only with China, but with Asia in general. So Japan, India, and South Korea are very important economic partners in the region. Trade between Latin America and Asia grew by 20% in the last 12 years, with trade between the 2 regions totaling $442 billion in 2011. Asia now accounts for 21% of Latin American trade. The U.S. accounts for a bit more, coming in at about 34% of trade in the region. China also tends to engage with the region by means of investment. In general, we've seen 3 main types of Chinese investment in Latin America. The vast majority of Chinese investment remains focused on securing access to and developing the region's raw materials and commodity sectors, so oil, copper, soy, etc. Other investment, however, is intended to identify new markets for Chinese products. So we've seen a lot of this with Chinese cars in Colombia and Brazil, for example, or cell phones in Argentina. And then still other Chinese investors are seeking increases in trade and in transactional efficiency by taking advantage of existing trade agreements in the region. So, something like NAFTA or the free trade agreement between the U.S. and Colombia and so on. Others are investing in Mexico, for example, to take advantage of the proximity of the U.S. market. Here you'll find some of China's major investments in Latin America between 2009 and 2011. Not counting FDI to the Cayman Islands and the British Virgin Islands, which still receive the vast majority of Chinese FDI, Chinese investment in Latin America increased from 22 million in 2003 to 350 million in 2009. The major recipients between 2003 and 2010 were Brazil, which received 41% of Chinese FDI, Venezuela with 15%, and then Peru, Argentina, and Chile. Although China's FDI has grown fairly rapidly in recent years and received quite a bit of press, it still accounts for only a small portion of total FDI to Latin America. The U.S. invested approximately $142 billion, by contrast, in the region, and Japan also still invests much more in Latin America than does China. China also has increased the amount that it is lending to countries in the region. So Chinese loans to Latin America totaled approximately $75 billion in 2005, since 2005, excuse me, over the past about 6 years, according to a study by Kevin Gallagher that was published by the Inter-American Dialogue a few months ago. And according to the same study, the majority of Chinese finance has gone to only 4 countries: Venezuela, Ecuador, Brazil, and Argentina. It is distributed mainly by 2 banks, by China's 2 big policy banks, so the China Development Bank and the China Exim Bank, Export-Import Bank. And we now know that CDB, or China Development Bank, loans to the region often have higher interest rates than those of the World Bank, for example, and this is contrary to popular belief. But the China Exim Bank offers lower interest rates than the U.S. Exim Bank. Also, in contrast to international financial institutions, there are no policy or institutional requirements associated with Chinese credit, and this is why it's so attractive to many countries in Latin America and elsewhere. But China does sometimes require that recipient countries purchase Chinese equipment, that they contract with Chinese companies, or agree to oil sales. In addition to economic relations, China also is engaging with the region in many, many other ways. According to its 2008 policy paper on Latin America and the Caribbean, China is seeking political, economic, cultural, social, and security-related cooperation with Latin America as well. And each year, we see more and more examples of these types of interactions and cooperation. We just saw political exchanges between Chinese officials and representatives from political parties in Cuba, Peru, and Brazil, for example. With respect to culture, we see educational exchange through 21 Confucius Institutes established throughout the region. China Radio International is operating in many different countries, as is CCTV in Espanol. There's quite a bit of evidence also in terms of agricultural cooperation with respect to the environment and also on climate change. That's been the case over the past 2 years in particular. And there's also quite a bit of aid given to the Caribbean, mostly, much of which is related to Taiwan diplomatic competition. One of the major areas of interest right now in the field of China and Latin America relations, if it can be considered a field, is whether Chinese firms, which have essentially spearheaded China's recent global economic engagement, are beholden to a well-coordinated Beijing-driven overseas strategy. If they are, this means that the Chinese state has a hand in most all interactions abroad, and that China would be capable of exercising its interests abroad in a fairly well-coordinated and effective manner. Evidence suggests that Chinese firms are not generally operating according to a grand strategy for global engagement, and I'll explain this a bit further in a moment. These boxes used to be Chinese characters. They just didn't show up here, for those of you who read Chinese. China does have a going out strategy, this thing called a going out strategy. In Chinese, it's called 走出去战略. And it was first proposed in the 1990s in an attempt to send Chinese firms abroad to trade in sectors of strategic importance to China. It was also intended to internationalize Chinese enterprises, which until the past decade hadn't had much experience doing business outside of the country. One of the most important effects of this going out strategy is that China's economic engagement with Latin America and other regions has been predominantly led by its firms over the past decade. The going out strategy is sometimes seen as a well-coordinated and centralized Chinese effort to secure access to raw materials and agricultural goods from Latin America and other regions, Africa, Southeast Asia, and so on. However, there are many cases in which the interests of Chinese state enterprises are not well aligned with those of the central government. And this is evident with respect to China's big oil firms in particular. Research suggests that instead the activities of Chinese firms are driven by profit motives and not necessarily by a grand strategy put forth by Beijing. This is not to say that China hasn't established policies and directives for its foreign firms. Here, for example, you'll see an investment guide for Chinese firms that was put together by 3 Chinese ministries, listed there on the right. It's just that in many cases, the Chinese central government has neither the control nor the time necessary to effectively manage all of its overseas operations. So for this reason, we see a wide variety of interactions and behaviors among Chinese firms in Latin America. Many of these firms are operating nearly autonomously. One of the reasons that this happens is that the administrative rank of leaders of China's major state-owned enterprises, so the big ones, Sinopec, and these other big state-owned firms, is often equal to that of the ministerial officials who are responsible for supervising them. So it's therefore exceedingly difficult for these ministries to implement government directives in an effective manner. Another reason is that the responsibilities of the ministries with respect to overseas firm supervision aren't yet well defined or delineated, so it's not clear how they're supposed to supervise a lot of these overseas firms. Another question that I hear quite often and that I'd like to address here is how well do Chinese and Latin Americans understand each other? And is understanding between these two regions improving? In general, I would say that there is very little understanding between Chinese and Latin Americans, primarily because this new phase in China-Latin America relations is still fairly new, and geographically, China and Latin America are very distant. Chinese failure to understand Latin America can be blamed, at least partially, on the Chinese press, which tends to report only on high-level exchanges, on violence in Mexico and Central America, and on agreements reached by Chinese firms in the region. In Latin America, the situation is not much better, although the press covers quite a bit more with respect to China. In general, China's academic literature on Latin America tends to characterize Latin America as a region without much potential. Chinese authors see it instead as a region that can offer China lessons about what not to do in terms of economic and social policy. A few months ago, I had the opportunity to speak with a Latin American expert at the Shanghai Institutes of International Studies, and he mentioned that in China, there's a tendency to look at Latin America as a negative example in terms of economic development in particular. It's very true that most Chinese academic studies on Latin America analyze mistakes that Latin America has made with respect to the middle income trap, urbanization, capital account liberalization, economic equality, and the list goes on. And then they go on to derive lessons for China based on Latin America's mistakes. So this is kind of how China is viewing Latin America at the moment. When trying to determine how well China and Latin America understand each other, we put together maps of the major Latin American studies programs in China, and you'll see them here color-coded. And then the major Chinese studies programs in Latin America. And I don't have time to go into detail on these right now, but if you're interested in more information on these programs or on sort of cross-regional understanding, you can find these maps and click on these various programs on my blog, which is www.chinaandlatinamerica.com. So it's an interactive map that you can use to take a look. And then the question that I've been hearing most often now from analysts in Latin America and business people in Latin America, and then also is being discussed quite a bit in China as well, is what domestic factors in China are likely to influence relations with Latin America over the next few years. And this is of considerable concern now that China's growth is slowing. I think Wen Jiabao yesterday said it's at 7.8%. Some banks say it's lower than that. Could reach 7% by the end of the year. In reality, there are countless factors in China and globally that could influence China's relations with Latin America. As the second largest economy in the world, China's stability and prosperity are factors in most any global economic calculation. But what I'd like to discuss today are China's proposed social and economic policies through the end of the decade. And the policies I will address are outlined in the country's 12th five-year plan in particular, and then also in numerous speeches and government documents. But before I launch into an analysis of the five-year plan, I think it's important to note that China's five-year plans are not reliable predictive tools. They are, however, very useful when identifying those challenges that China's government intends to address in the coming years. Just a little bit of background. China's five-year plans began in 1953. We're now on the 12th five-year plan, which runs from 2011 to 2015. And they're approved in a long process through the steps listed on the right. So they go through these various commissions and committees, through various processes of revision. In China, the 12th five-year plan is referred to as 12.5, which means 12.5 in Chinese. It was published, as I mentioned, in 2011 and has several areas of focus. It's hundreds of pages long, depending upon how you print it, I guess. But three areas of focus in particular are thought to have important implications for future relations with Latin America, and I've listed them here on the slide. The first area of focus is a full-scale economic transformation from GDP growth sustained by domestic investment to growth supported by higher rates of private consumption as a share of GDP. The second major area of focus that's thought to have implications for Latin America is industrial reform. And then the third is environmental degradation and resource scarcity. So first of all, economic transformation. To maintain high levels of growth over the next few decades, the Chinese government understands that it must increase the contribution of private consumption to GDP growth. Chinese are notorious for consuming very, very little, especially in comparison to other developed countries. It has therefore proposed what it calls an economic transformation. In Chinese, it's called 经济转型, as part of its 12th five-year plan, as I mentioned. So this sort of economic transformation has been part of previous plans as well. It was part of the 11th five-year plan. But at that time, the government had to increase and not decrease levels of domestic investment to combat the effects of the global financial crisis. And now, interestingly, despite a sustained interest in structural transformation, we're seeing signs that China may be increasing domestic investment yet again to deal with its slowing growth. But in any case, according to the 12th Five-Year Plan, China will attempt to increase private consumption by means of three strategies, and they're listed here. The first is urbanization. And urbanization is a process that we've seen taking place in China for almost 30 years. Urbanization requires quite a bit of domestic investment, but in theory produces more employment and also higher salaries and would thereby increase consumption. The second involves strengthening the social safety net and reducing the amount that Chinese need to save for medical and educational expenses so they have more money to spend on other purchases. And then the third involves across-the-board salary increases. The idea being that if Chinese have more money, they will consume more. Here you see evidence of China's ongoing urbanization, which I mentioned as an integral part of the country's economic transformation. Cities are thought to produce more jobs and higher salaries and thereby encourage higher rates of consumption in the longer term. In 2030, it's estimated that there will be approximately 900 million Chinese living in cities. Now, just over half of the population resides in urban areas. This is an image that I took from the 12th Five-Year Plan that shows China's proposal for a series of connected, what they call megacities and industrial zones. And this is also part of China's broader urbanization process. According to the 12th Five-Year Plan, China also plans to construct a complex network of rail and road to connect growing cities and industrial centers and to further develop China's expansive central and western provinces. And here you see a graphic of China's rail network plans in particular. These projects, 45,000 kilometers of high-speed rail, 83,000 kilometers of highway, large-scale hydropower plants across the country, and millions of units of low-income housing. And China's urbanization efforts more broadly will continue to require large quantities of raw materials, many of which will be imported from Latin America and elsewhere. China's imports of iron ore, of crude oil, and copper already account for more than 20% of its total imports. These are some of the social objectives that China has indicated in its 12th Five-Year Plan, and they are proposed not only as part of this broader economic transformation, but also to address growing rural, urban, and socioeconomic disparity in China. If you take a look at the chart here, China proposes to increase urban and rural income by 7% per year, and to maintain urban unemployment at below 5%. It also proposes the creation of 45 million new jobs in urban areas in the next 5 years as part of its urbanization process. A second area of focus in the 12th Five-Year Plan is industrial reform. And this has been a part of government planning in China for decades. In the 12th Five-Year Plan, the government promotes the restructuring of 9 existing industries, and they're listed here on the slide, and then the development of 7 new strategic industries. It also proposes a renovation of the industrial system throughout the country, so development of infrastructure in the West, which is, widespread empty land, a lot of it at the moment, a renovation of the industrial base in the Northeast, production of modern equipment in the central region, and then development of strategic sectors on the East Coast. These plans are intended to promote Chinese innovation, first of all, and then also to improve the efficiency of Chinese industry overall. As is the case with China's urbanization efforts, if the country implements its proposed industrial reforms, this will require significant quantities of raw materials, many of which will come from Latin America. And Goldman Sachs and other banks have predicted high levels of Chinese demand for raw materials in the next decade based on the country's urbanization and industrialization plans. The third and final major feature of China's 5-year plan that I'll address here involves environment and climate change. Resource constraints and environmental degradation are of tremendous concern right now to Chinese officials. Environmental issues not only threaten future economic growth, but also political stability. Most protests in recent years have been related to pollution and environmental concerns. In the 12th Five-Year Plan, China has proposed a series of environmental reforms, including protection of land, restoration of rivers, air quality measures, waste treatment facilities, climate change measures, etc. But most importantly, with respect to Latin America, China's environmental issues have very important implications in terms of food security. In China, nearly 20% of the land is desert. And because of poor farming practices, drought, and growing demand for groundwater, desertification has become one of the country's most critical environmental challenges. And it's really interesting. We see China working with Africa quite a bit on these desertification issues, because Africa obviously faces some of the similar problems. Chinese scientists estimate that at current levels of demand, China will need to import 13% of its agricultural goods from abroad. South America's major soy producers, Argentina, Brazil, and Paraguay, for example, have benefited considerably over the past decade from China's growing demand. In addition, assuming China is able to expand its middle class through the various mechanisms outlined in its 12th Five-Year Plan, demand for a more diverse selection of foods will grow considerably, as will demand for safer agricultural products. So, China's environmental and food security concerns mean tremendous opportunity for agricultural exports in Latin America in particular. And we see many agricultural sectors in Latin America taking notice of this and actually traveling to China to try to encourage more in the way of exports of goods that are specific to whatever country they're coming from. To conclude, I would say that the China-Latin America relationship has been based on trade so far, and to a lesser extent on investment, at least over the past decade. And trade, it seems, will remain the basis for relations over the next decade and beyond, driven primarily by China's demand for natural resources. If China is successful in implementing some of the urbanization and industrialization efforts outlined in its 12th Five-Year Plan, we can expect continued high levels of demand for Latin American commodities. Its success in doing so, however, will depend on China's own economic growth prospects and on its domestic stability, which are very uncertain at the moment. At the very least, however, China will be increasingly looking to Latin America for food imports and for agricultural cooperation. Demand for agricultural goods from Latin America is expected to remain high even as China's growth slows. That's the case by most all calculations. So moving forward, I think we should see more forms of economic cooperation in particular, as well as growing collaboration on various areas mentioned in the Chinese policy paper that I had up earlier, the one that was written in 2008. And I really think that growing engagement should improve cross-regional understanding and China's somewhat skewed perceptions of the region, as seen in academic literature and also in the news. So thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you today briefly about China's primarily economic engagement. If you have any questions about other aspects of engagement, I'd be very happy to answer those. Or if you have any questions about what I've addressed so far, I'd be delighted to answer those as well. I think I have 2 questions here so far that have been submitted, and or many more. Let's see. The first is, why do you call Chinese lack of understanding of Latin Americans a failure? Isn't it more naturally expected pattern of countries to take time to gradually learn about and understand relatively new partners? That's true. This is a process, and as I mentioned, this new period of engagement has been one that's taken place only over the past decade, more or less. Economically speaking, Chinese engagement, it really enhanced engagement with Latin America began in 2001, as I mentioned, with its entrance into the WTO. And then a lot of people mark, enhanced engagement from 2004 when President Hu Jintao visited APEC, the APEC summit in Chile, in Santiago, Chile, and promised considerably expanded trade with the region. So yes, it's a very new relationship and one that will continue to deepen. Neither country has done too terribly much in terms of education, however, to really expand, language programs and regional studies programs in terms of, Latin American studies or Chinese studies, depending upon where you are. So in that sense, there is kind of a failure to address a need to understand these other regions a bit better. That's why I would say failure. Next question. From an economic standpoint, will Latin America become more dependent on trade with China? That's a very good question, and one that the Latin Americans are asking themselves quite a bit. To a certain extent, they already have, but you really have to look at specific countries. It's very much a country by country issue and a sector by sector issue. There's considerable concern in South America in particular among major commodities exporters, so major exporters specifically of soy, of iron ore, and of copper, that these countries are sort of reorienting their export systems, their economies to produce primarily commodities, and they're investing a lot in these sectors in particular at the expense of the manufacturing sector. So there's a lot of talk of resource curse, of deindustrialization, of export primarization, and so on. There aren't too many great studies telling us whether or not these processes are actually happening, and there's quite a bit of debate within these countries about whether deindustrialization is really an issue. But yes, there's the fear that dependency definitely is increasingly a problem, and if the prices of commodities were to drop significantly, and there's that's already happening in terms of iron ore as China's growth slows, that these countries and commodity sectors in particular will be very hard hit. So it's something that regional organizations are trying to prepare Latin American countries for and encourage them to initiate policies that will protect them in the case of falling commodities prices. Third question, what role do you see the Panama Canal playing in China's engagement strategy with Latin America? This is a great question and something I've been meaning to look into a bit more. There was a big confusion, not too many years ago, about China's role in sort of managing the Panama Canal, and there was a sense that China was, sort of integral at this point to the function of the canal, managing its daily operations. And I would imagine that some of the people some of the guests who are listening right now may know a bit more about this than I do. So if I'm wrong, please do let me know. But it's my understanding that China simply controls the gates on either side of the canal, and that's its primary function at this point. What is interesting is that China has been working with various countries in South America in particular to try and establish an alternate route, land-based route, instead of using the canal. They're suggesting, for example, they've talked to President Santos in Colombia about a dry canal, is what they call it, from the port in Buenaventura over to the Atlantic coast. And they've talked to Brazil and Peru about a land-based route as well. So you see all kinds of talk about other alternative means of transporting goods, and a lot of this infrastructure development that China ends up promoting is supportive of that in certain ways. Aside from that, I don't know too much more about China's engagement in the Panama Canal, and so I'll leave it at that. What is your assessment of anti-Chinese sentiment in the region? That's a great question as well. it really varies tremendously from country to country and from sector to sector. So, as I mentioned previously, there are certain countries that have benefited tremendously from trade with China, and they tend to be those countries in South America that are major commodities exporters. And so overall, sentiment in those countries is fairly positive. These countries are happy about their relationship with China and see it as being very promoting of growth. In Mexico and in Central America, in particular, there's tremendous, there's not the degree of trade complementarity that you have in South America. There's a lot of competition in terms of trade. And so you see Mexico's maquiladora style of manufacturing and its textile exports and so on being affected tremendously by China's exports and Chinese low-cost manufacturing. And so there has been, in the past at least, quite a bit of anti-China sentiment in Mexico in particular, with Chinese flag burning and demonstrations and so on, especially as a lot of these factories were closing about 5 years ago. Even in countries, though, where there is generally a positive sense of, or positive perception toward China, you have certain sectors that are being affected. For example, manufacturing in Brazil, which is very anti-China and has been very effective in lobbying the government to impose tariffs on Chinese goods, most recently a tax on imported vehicles, which was targeting specifically cheap Chinese cars that were coming in, and other sort of protectionist measures. So it really, really does depend on the country and then on the specific sector. Oh, another thing I should mention in that regard is another thing that tends to indigenous communities in Peru and Ecuador in particular have been opposed to Chinese mining projects, and so we are seeing quite a bit of that and have over the past few years. And then the other thing that tends to rile local populations is a tendency among Chinese firms to bring in Chinese labor instead of using local labor. And there are a variety of reasons why that's done. For example, often the local workers don't have the right sorts of permits or training to do the work, and so that's why Chinese tend to bring in a lot, but also they're trying to provide work for their own population. So that's something else where you see a lot of protests. There was a huge protest recently around the Baja Mar Resort in the Bahamas about this very issue, where China was bringing in thousands of its own workers. Do the Chinese view Latin America's manufacturing and tech industries as competition? No. The Chinese do not tend to view Latin American manufacturing and tech as competition. There are very few sectors and a few companies that they see that they could learn quite a bit from, but they see themselves surpassing these companies within a few years. For example, Embraer in Brazil. China is in the process of trying to develop its own and manufacture its own aircraft, and will probably do so, its own commercial aircraft, excuse me, within a few years, maybe 10, some people say. At the moment, there's an interesting development in that Mexican labor is a bit cheaper than Chinese labor in certain cases in the Pearl River Delta. So, I mean, in that sense, there is a degree of competition in that you can produce more cheaply in Mexico, especially if you're exporting to the U.S., than you can on certain occasions in China, especially as salaries rise, as I was mentioning in my presentation. Can you provide an overview of telecommunication investments in Latin America? Do the Chinese conduct opinion polling in Latin American countries to track the opinions of local populations vis-a-vis them? And have you seen any serious backlash of host nation personnel against the Chinese, like similar events in Southeast Asia? The backlash, I haven't seen quite as much in Latin America as in Southeast Asia or in Burma. There was a huge protest regarding a hydroelectric facility that was being built there, and then the company ended up having to move. We've seen tremendous backlash and even violence against Chinese workers in Africa. There have been a couple of incidents, and there have been certainly protests and demonstrations against the Chinese, primarily in Peru and Ecuador, and primarily by indigenous populations and then sort of environmental groups. One of the major cases that's generally referenced is there's a company called Shogang Hierro. It's a Chinese company, Chinese mining firm that was in Peru not too long ago and had promised the local community reparations for losses that they incurred as a result of mining project, and then did not follow through on those promises. And there were demonstrations, and then a couple of people were killed, local people, and so that was a tremendous image issue for the Chinese, especially since they were just beginning to engage the region in a more in a more enhanced manner, right? But I think the Chinese learned quite a bit from that, and have since been operating very much like other multinational firms, for better or worse, right? So that's kind of the one major gaffe that people tend to point to. Telecommunication investments in Latin America. Of course, the one company that everybody points to and is terrified of is Huawei, and that's something that you hear a lot about in the U.S. In Latin America, nobody's terrified of Huawei and welcome Huawei investment. Huawei is a major telecommunications telephone firm coming out of China. It's state-owned. I know that Huawei and a French company have partnered to do a underwater, I believe it's called this is not my area, as you can tell, but cable essentially for internet that would extend from Venezuela to certain islands in the Caribbean and then potentially to Cuba. China, I know, also has participated in or has helped Cuba to develop a certain SIGINT capability. That was many, many years ago that it did that, and has not yet done, as far as I know at least, and you all would know more than I in this regard, hasn't done much more with Cuba in that respect, aside from developing sort of internal communications. Otherwise, it's very, very involved in, certain just general phone line communication, a lot of cell phones, but I don't know the specifics of that, and if you want to email me directly, I could try and find some information for you. I've not heard of any opinion polling, by the way, in countries of local populations to try and do sort of atmospherics. I haven't heard of anything like that on the Chinese side. Does China have a priority list of countries that it targets economically in Latin America? Yes. As part of the going out strategy, it's targeting countries that are, very endowed with commodities. That's what China needs. If you look back at my PowerPoint presentation, you'll see a guide for investment. It's written in Chinese, and within that guide it lists, at least in the Latin America section, it lists, I believe, 15 different Latin American countries and specific sectors in which Chinese firms should invest should they go there. And so none of this is mandated, but there are a lot of suggestions issued by the Chinese government in terms of investment and also trade. But again, as I mentioned, a lot of these Chinese firms are operating based on profit motives and not according to directives issued by the Chinese central government. And so that's something to consider. They're operating very autonomously. Is there any interest in Latin America for China to help develop transportation infrastructure such as high-speed rail? Yes, there has been quite a bit of interest, and Wen Jiabao just went to the region to participate in Rio +20 summit, but also visited several countries in the region, and all of them spoke with him about the possibility of financing infrastructure projects. High-speed rail is one thing that they mentioned. China already has contributed quite a bit of money to the development of city-based subway systems. Roads, just general road building, isn't as big in Latin America as it is in Africa, although there is some of that in the Caribbean. But yeah, infrastructure, ports, big facilities are huge, and the Chinese are seen as being very capable of working on these sorts of projects and of financing them and doing them quickly. So this is something that not only Latin America, but the United States is interested in getting money for. I know the DC government just went to China to try and finance rail cars on H Street. So it's not only Latin America, but also the U.S. that's doing this. both regions have established drug networks. Can you speak on how these affect China-Latin America relations? I've heard quite a bit about there being some Chinese participation in actually in the drug trade to a certain degree, just illicit trade of drugs with Chinese involvement. And I don't know a lot of specifics, but I have 2 papers that I could pass your way. So if you want to email me, I could go ahead and do that, and I'll refrain from trying to come up with a comment. Where does Beijing believe its interests diverge from the South American commodity-producing nations? Well, essentially, it's the problem, and this is brought up in most any negotiation, in most any meeting between Latin American nations and Beijing, is that Beijing is exporting primarily, manufactured goods to Latin America, and Latin America increasingly is exporting primary commodities. And that's not a good model for long-term development for Latin America. So that's really where the majority of contention comes from in the relationship. And what's interesting is Beijing knows this, or China knows this, and so recently it established a strategic relationship with ECLAC, which is what does it stand for? The Economic Commission on Latin America and the Caribbean, which is part of the UN, and determined that it was going to work with ECLAC to try and diversify Latin American exports to China. So it's at least paying lip service to this issue. I don't know if they're going to follow through and actually do anything in that regard, but China recognizes that this is a problem in terms of sort of long-term relationship development. How are the Chinese using their military as a tool to increase their influence in the region? Military partnerships, training, engagement trips, etc. The Chinese military has engaged, there are limited arms sales, especially in comparison to the US and the EU. Very, very limited. You have small arms, you have some helicopters, you have some engagement in terms of satellite development, especially in Brazil. That was one of the first major ways in which Brazil and China engaged, was on the development and launching of satellites. In Bolivia, there's the Tupac Amaru satellite that's about to go up, or it may already have, so they can cooperate with Bolivia too in that regard. China has the Peace Ark hospital ship, which has gone around, done kind of a tour similar to what you see with Partnership of the Americas, although a bit more limited, doing, sort of a little bit of military engagement, some exchanges, and then also, providing medical services to local populations. So it's kind of a similar model as what you see in the U.S. There are limited exchanges. You'll see some Latin Americans going to China. I don't know as much about Chinese going to Latin America, and that would be something to look at. If you really want to learn more about this in particular, I would look up Evan Ellis, E-L-L-I-S, who is at the National Defense University, and he's written extensively on military engagement in particular. Is there a continued push by China to force Latin America to cut diplomatic ties with Taiwan? Does this have any impact on the regions where mainland has a footprint? Yes, and this is a great question. There are 12 countries in Latin America, and all of them are located in Central America and the Caribbean, that still recognize Taiwan. And they are, tiny, tiny nations. There is technically a diplomatic truce right now between China, mainland China, and Taiwan. So these two countries are not supposed to necessarily be engaging in sort of diplomatic competition in Africa and Latin America like they have in the past. This has been the case ever since Ma Ying-jeou, the current president of Taiwan, came into power. But China does still engage the Caribbean in particular, and has been offering quite a bit in the way of aid and quite a bit in the way of trade, which is very, very promising for these countries, especially as trade and aid from Europe and the US has diminished considerably over the past few years. So being that China is an increasingly attractive trade partner and benefactor, yes, it has considerable influence in the region and continues to use that for political purposes, primarily this Taiwan issue. And the indication now is that most all of these countries are interested in switching to an affiliation with the PRC, with mainland China, but that China hasn't necessarily allowed them to do so for fear of exacerbating the cross-strait situation. what is the role of Chinese public diplomacy policies with Latin America, and how do you see that affecting their relationship? Chinese public diplomacy, China talks a lot about soft power in its sort of overseas policy, and I've yet to fully understand China's definition of soft power. It tends to range from cultural engagement and movies and things like this to military engagement. It's a wide range and not your typical Joseph Nye version of soft power. But its public diplomacy and at least its cultural engagement has expanded exponentially over the past 5 years in particular. If you go through the news in Spanish and look up China, you'll see countless examples of this. In this country, there's a Chinese film festival. Here, there's a Chinese New Year celebration. Over here, you have representatives from the People's National Congress visiting their counterparts in Jamaica. Across the board in every country, China is really trying to step up its public diplomacy, public engagement, cultural engagement, and even language engagement. As I mentioned before, Confucius Institutes are being established throughout the region. There are 21 now, and then there are also Confucius classrooms, which are a little bit different. But these are, the intent is to spread Chinese language and culture throughout the region, and they are successful to a certain degree. And people increasingly, I was just in Colombia addressing a group of business people, and at least half had taken Chinese in their country, and through a program that was established very recently, often with the help of the Chinese government. So it's working. It's working there. It's nothing like what you see with the U.S. in terms of cultural engagement, but it's there. And I believe that's all of the questions. So thank you very much to everyone. If there's anything else, I'm happy to answer.
Alright everyone, this is Staff Sergeant Bryant. I'd like to thank Margaret for speaking for us today. That was a great presentation. If you have any questions or you wanted further information, you can email us at info@culturalknowledge.org or speakers@culturalknowledge.org. Up in the top left-hand corner, there's some links. One is for Margaret's blog, one is for the CKC homepage. I will leave the window open for a few minutes, so if you wanted to get any of that information, feel free. And thank you very much for participating.